And we are live. Welcome to the 4th episode of Potzblitz, the weekly lightning talk. Today we have a very special guest, Christian Decker of Blockstream. They also call him Dr. Bitcoin. And our co-host today is Michael Folkson from the London BitDevs meetup, who is also doing a bunch of Socratic seminars and has a deep technical knowledge, so he will be the perfect person to talk to Christian, and has already prepared a bunch of questions. We announced this on Twitter a couple of days ago, so he's been collecting a couple of questions already. If you do have questions during the stream, put them in the YouTube comments, please, or ask them on Twitter using the hashtag Potzblitz. And we also have a MetaMost channel, mm.fulmo.org. The channel is called Potzblitz, and you can also find Christian there. He'll be checking it out later. And as always, once we're done streaming, you can also join the MetaMost channel and the Jitsi room and hang out a bit and ask some more questions. I expect that we will not have time to answer all of your questions today. So just please join us in the Jitsi channel afterwards. We are using Jitsi to stream this. It's an open source video conferencing tool, and it usually works quite well. Sometimes it doesn't, but most of the time it does. So if there are any glitches, please forgive us. It is basically permissionless without collecting your data. So we thought this would be a pretty good option to do this. If you like this, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel so we can do this another time. And I think that's about it. Already introduced the speakers. So here's Christian, and the topic of his talk is back the F*CK up. Thank you for coming, Christian.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I hope people will understand or sort of excuse my swear word in the title, but it sort of fit in quite nicely with my feelings about backups, or the lack thereof in Lightning. So let me quickly pull up the presentation I've prepared. So that should be live, is it? Jeff?
It's working all good.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, the title today is basically back the fuck up, how to back up and secure your Lightning node in a way that you cannot end up losing money by operating your node. Like Jeff said, I'm Christian Decker. I work for Blockstream, hence the small logo up there. And I work mainly on the C-Lightning implementation of the Lightning protocol, on which I also help out a bit. And you might have noticed that later on, because I tend to sort of emphasize what C-Lightning does correctly, but more on that later. So first of all, why do we want to back up in the first place? And I think everybody will be shouting right now that we're actually handling money, and so the rationale for having a backup of what is handling our money is pretty fundamental. The way we do backups in on-chain systems, like your Ledger wallets or your Bitcoin Core nodes, or all manner of systems where you perform on-chain payments, is basically just write down 24 words. And if you ever destroy or lose your device, you can basically recover from those 24 words, which basically just seed a random number generator, which is then used to generate addresses. So this is quite a common thing in the on-chain world, where basically you just have your 24 words, you write them down on paper, you send half of them to your parents, or you engrave them on metal, all in the name of making this as disaster resilient as possible and ensuring that you can actually recover. So that's quite an easy option. We can do that in Lightning as well. However, it turns out that backups in Lightning are quite a bit more harder, and they can even be dangerous. And to see why they are dangerous, let's quickly go through how not to back up a Lightning node. So if you're anything like me, you probably end up with a couple of backups like this, where we have sort of the original .lightning folder, and then at some point we decided, yeah, we might want to take a backup of that, so we rename that directory or copy it over to something with an extension. So let's call it orig, and then we do some more changes, and then we perform another backup, and then we call it v1. But we're the computer scientists, so we start by counting at 0, and so even our naming scheme becomes very inconsistent over time. But that's not the whole issue. The whole issue is that even if we're able to take backups of our Lightning node, the act of restoring it can put some of our funds in danger. Simply because of the mechanism that we use in the Lightning Network to update state. And to see that, we basically need to look at what the update mechanism in Lightning does. So in Lightning, we use a mechanism that is called a penalty-based mechanism, in which each of these square boxes here represents a state. So initially, we have the initial state where the person A has 10 Bitcoins and the other participant in the channel has 0. Then we transfer 1 Bitcoin over, and suddenly we have 2 states that are active. And so what we do is, once we have agreed on this state, we poison the old state. So if any participant ever ends up publishing this transaction representing our state, this poison would be activated, and the misbehaving node that has misbehaved by publishing an old state would lose all of its funds. And so we do that a couple of times, transferring 1 from A to B. Then we transfer 4 more from A to B. We then poison the old state, and this state is currently active. And then we perform another update, and this is a bit special in that we don't actually transfer money, but these state transitions can also occur because, for example, we changed the fee that we need to pay on chain, and therefore even non-user triggered actions can result in a state change that would end up agreeing on a new state and poisoning the old state. And finally, we take this last state and transfer from B to A one more Bitcoin. And so this final state, which does not have the biohazard symbol, is basically the only state that can be enacted without incurring a penalty. And all of the prior states are poisoned. So by poison, I mean the counterparty always has a matching reaction that could use to be punish if I were to publish this old transaction. And so if we were to take a backup anywhere here, we might end up losing some information. And so the problem is exactly that. This is a copy of the previous image. Basically, we both A and B agreed on this state being the last state. However, because I took a backup of this state and then had to restore this state, for me, it appears that this is actually the last valid state, and I should be able to send that state on chain and basically get my 5 Bitcoins. However, that would be cheating from the point of view of my counterparty, because they actually have a matching poison or a matching penalty transaction for this state. And so if I were trying to enact this state, then I would lose my my whole stake in this channel. So not only is backing up and restoring a Lightning node rather hard, but it's also quite dangerous, because if you end up with restoring a state that wasn't the last one, you might accidentally end up cheating. And so over the time, we, the Lightning developers, came up with a range of possible solutions to mitigate the situation or even prevent it altogether. And sadly, none of these is complete or gives you a 100% protection, but we're getting closer. Yeah. So what I'd like to do is basically step through the various mechanisms that have been used previously, and what we are working towards right now when it comes to securing the data that you have in the channel. And so the first one is something that Eclair did right at the start when we started rolling out these Lightning nodes, is that Eclair, Assange, the developers of Eclair, were getting some feedback that it's hard to, that people were losing their devices with the Lightning node on them, and that they were unable to recover the funds on those phones. I mean, it's quite natural if you have a phone. Phones have a tendency to drop into water or break or just get lost. And if you have money on those on the phone, that's doubly sad. So what the Eclair team did was they added a trivial backup mechanism that would just take the state of the Lightning node after each change and would push that to a Google Drive folder from where they could basically restore the entire state. Now, I'm not too familiar with how this was done, whether it was done incrementally or whether it was done in a batch. However, this mechanism seems not to be working anymore, simply because people soon figured out that if I start my Eclair wallet on phone A and I then restore on phone B, hey, I can run this node from both phones at the same time, and they share data with each other, and basically the perfect thing. But like I said before, is that if you end up restoring a node that is not the latest state, you end up cheating. That same thing happens if you have two nodes running against the same data set, pretending to have the same channels, and therefore contradicting each other while they proceed in the Lightning protocol. And this may then end up again looking like a cheat attempt and the nodes being punished. So this first attempt was mainly used for recovery, but people abused it a bit for to share a single node across multiple devices. So don't do this. A better solution are the static channel backups that are implemented in LND. As you can see on the left side, this is basically the structure that a single channel static backup looks like. It has a whole bunch of information that relates to how the channel was created, who the counterparty is, and all of the information that is basically static in the channel and doesn't change over time. And so what this allows you to do is basically to start the LND node back up again with this backup file and restore what they call a channel shell. Not a true channel, but enough information about the channel so that you can reconnect to your peer and ask for information that is relevant for you to get your funds back. Now, this is rather neat because it allows you to basically take a static channel backup, store it somewhere offline. It's probably not small enough that you can write it on a piece of paper and write it back in when you want to restore it, but you can store it on a USB stick, or you can store it on a file server somewhere. So that alone should allow you to at least get your funds back. So it's minimal in that sense. It doesn't change while you're renegotiating the state of the channel itself. And so for each channel, you take one backup, and you're safe for until you open the next channel, basically. The downside is that it requires you to actually be able to contact the counterparty node once you attempt to recover, simply because this information that we track in the Lightning protocol cannot be recomputed solely from this structure, but you basically need to reach out to your peer and ask it, hey, what's the current state? Please give me all of the information to recognize and to retrieve my funds after closure. Oh, and please go and close the channel. So this basically just reconnects and tells it to close the channel. The downside is, of course, that relying on the peer to actually do something for you might get you into a weird situation, because you're basically telling the peer, hey, I lost my data. Can you please help me recover my funds? And the counterparty could basically not give you that information, or it can refuse to actually close the channel on your behalf, which then results in them holding your funds hostage. And so all of the current implementations implement this correctly, and they will collaborate with LND nodes to recover their funds. But a malicious actor could, of course, change the code so that LND nodes cannot close successfully or recover successfully. So while this is not a perfect backup, it's an excellent emergency recovery mechanism to claw back as much of your initial funds as possible. So the third mechanism that we have, and this goes more into what C-Lightning is viewing as the correct version of doing this, is the ability for plugins that you can attach to C-Lightning to basically keep a synchronous database log in the background on whatever medium you want to do. And the reason why we made this into a plugin is because we don't want to tell you how to manage these backups, and we want you to be to have the ability of incorporating them into your own environment. And so this basically just tells the plugins every database transaction that would result in a modification of the state before we actually commit to this transaction. So it's a write-ahead log of the database transactions that we track before committing to changes. And so, depending on your infrastructure, you might want to have an append-only log. You can have compressible logs, or you can even have a replica of the original database being managed concurrently to the main database. And if you do that, then you basically can fail over immediately if your node dies. So what you do is basically have a replica that tracks changes along the main database on a network mount. And if your node dies, you can spin up another node and connect to the replica, and you can just continue where you left off. And so we don't rely on external help. We don't need to interact with our peer, which might not even be available anymore. But the downside is, of course, that these are synchronous backups that require us to write to the backup every time that we have a state change. And so this is one mechanism. The other mechanism that C-Lightning has is the database replication and failover. We've abstracted the database interface in such a way that we can just take C Lightning and have it talk to a Postgres database, for example, whereas the default database is the SQLite 3 database. Now, Postgres does require a bit more setup, but it allows you to also have a synchronous replication of your node and even transparent failover from one database instance to the next one. So this is something that enterprise users are very much interested in because they can rely on what they already know about replicating and mirroring and failover on Postgres databases, which is very well known in the wider software engineer world. Whereas replicating and scaling a single node, Lightning node, that's very niche knowledge. So we can basically reconnect to what institutional knowledge there already is, and people feel pretty comfortable with the way that databases can get replicated and secured. So I mentioned this is more of an enterprise setup. It also comes with a bit of upfront investment costs to actually set up all of these nodes, set up the database, and have replication set up. But Gabriele Domenichini has written an excellent guide on how to set up Postgres in combination with C Lightning, and I can only recommend reading that and seeing if you can get it working as well. The upside in this is obviously that basically restore is immediate because we have replicas that have the up-to-date information, and so if the node dies, we just spin up a new node and have it connect to the database. If the database dies, we just switch over to a new master database, and the node doesn't even learn anything about the database having failed. And so this is another form of synchronous replication. And of course, this wouldn't be a talk by me if I weren't to somehow get L2 into the picture. L2 is a paper that we've written 2 years ago now about an alternative update mechanism in which we can have, in which we don't penalize people anymore for publishing an old state. Instead, what we do is we override the effects that your misbehavior would have and enact a state that we actually had. So what we have here is basically we have the setup transaction that creates a shared account, shared address between the blue user and the green user, and we create a refund transaction that gives the blue user. Oh, I have a small discrepancy here, but it would basically give the original owner back the funds after a certain timeout expires. And so the way we perform updates is by having an update 1 that takes these 10 Bitcoins here, ratchets them forward, and attaches this settlement 1 here, in which both parties have 5 Bitcoins each after this timeout expires. And then we update again by ratcheting these funds forward and attach this settlement 2 with the newer state. This time, the green user send 1 Bitcoin over to the blue user, and this update 2 basically overrides whatever would have happened in settlement 1. And so instead of punishing the counterparty for misbehaving, what we do is we override the effects they would have had. So let's say, in this case, the green user would like to enact this settlement, so it sends out update 1, and now has to wait for this timeout to expire. In the meantime, the blue user publishes update 2, overriding this settlement 1 and starting the timer on settlement 2. So we no longer punish our counterparty for misbehaving, but we override the effect and get to a state that was agreed upon in the end. And so if I were to back up and restore, and basically restore at the time that update 1 and settlement 1 were the last state, then all that would happen is basically that my counterparty would send out update 2 and basically correct my mistake instead of hitting me in my face by stealing all my funds. And so this is sort of this is something that would allow us to have a much more robust mechanism of backups and restore. And I think ultimately this might become the way that we end up doing stable nodes sometime in the future. Now, many people have argued that this loses the penalties. However, as far as I can see, the penalty mechanism is intrinsically linked with our inability to actually create backups and restore. Because whenever we back up and restore, we might end up in a situation where we can be penalized. And so I think we might want to distance ourselves from this satisfaction of punishing people and go to more a collaborative solution, which in this case would be L2. Okay, now I've just given you 5 different backup standards, but how about creating a unified one? Everybody seems to be pulling in a different direction, and everybody is experimenting with different ways of backing up and restoring. Wouldn't it be nice to sort of have a backup that can be created by C-Lightning and then later imported into LND and sort of restore from that? And the answer is, of course, that would be really nice if in the end we have this convergence of different ideas and different implementations where we actually agree on a unified standard for these kinds of operations. However, currently, at least, the internal structure of the data that we track is not in a form that we can share these backups between implementations. Maybe eventually we will get there, but currently that's not the case. And I would actually argue that this experimental phase in which we are currently is good, because it allows us to experiment with different trade-offs and come up with better ideas in the long run that are then capable of getting a majority of the ecosystem behind it and actually make this a better standard overall. Because that's always been the way that the Lightning development has worked. We've always gone off into different direction and then remerged back and shared experiences from the way that some of our approaches worked and others didn't. And so my hope is there that we will end up with a unified standard. So I have one more slide, which is basically the resources where you can find all of these informations, starting with the cloud backup by Assank, the excellent article on recovering funds from LND using static channel backups. And we also have a couple of backup plugins and documentation on the DB right hook. And of course, how you can wire C-Lightning to run with a PostgreSQL database. And of course, Gabriele's excellent tutorial on how to set up replication with PostgreSQL so that you can have the real enterprise feeling for your node. And yeah, read the L2 paper. I think it's kind of neat, but of course I'm biased. So that's it from my side. And I'll quickly switch over to see all of your faces again, so I can actually get some human touch back. Hello.
Hello, human.
Thank you.
Well, I mean, you say human, but there's rumors out there that we aren't human.
Oh, yes. Sorry for that inaccuracy.
Would this be the proper time to ask you to take off your human mask?
Well, I can put up on some other masks, but.
Thank you, Christian, for your talk. I'm assuming, can we, because right now it just showed the titles, can you send us the links later so we can put it in the video description?
Yes, I do have a PDF version of this.
Great. We can just add that later on.
Yep.
Great.
Let me see.
So,
should have shared it beforehand.
if anybody has any questions, now is a good time to ask. Is either on YouTube or on the Mattermost channel, mm.fulmo.org. As I said earlier, Michael has already collected some questions from Twitter, so I guess Michael will jump into it right now.
I was itching to reply right there, but keeping the surprise for the live stream.
Excellent. So let's start with a few questions on the content in the presentation, and then we'll go over to the questions that we got from Twitter, because I don't think there were any Twitter questions that related to backups. So on backups, I think you alluded to some of the trade-offs. There's ease of use, there's trust in terms of requesting certain information from your remote party, there's security, there's cost. I mean, are there any other trade-offs, and which of those align towards a technical user, a non-technical user, and an enterprise?
So one very important one that I missed to mention before is that, of course, these backups come with some latency. So your node, depending on which backup you choose, you might end up sacrificing some of the throughput of your node simply by having to reach out to a backup plugin or to a remote storage or some other operations that you need to do in order to make this safe. The only option that doesn't incur this cost are the static channel backups, because they are basically done once at the beginning of your node being set up, and then then every time you open a channel, but there is no additional latency cost that you incur at each update. Whereas the full backup solutions, like pushing onto a cloud server or having some plugin, that will obviously incur cost at the time, throughput cost. So I think definitely the secure static channel backups are probably the easiest ones to set up. We're trying to make it as easy as possible for the plugins as well. We do have a plugin repository that is community driven, and so we do have people working on Dropbox backends where basically each single update gets written to Dropbox, and then we have compactions that end up working in the background. So eventually it should end up just being a plugin that you drop into a folder, and then everything is taken care of from there on. But yes, currently there is a bit of work that you need to invest to actually get these working. And of course, the extreme example is the replicated database backend, which really takes some digging to get right. Yeah, not for the faint-hearted, I guess, but we're getting there.
Cool. And so I imagine if either the L&D setup or another implementation comes up with a backup strategy that takes those trade-offs in a different way, but is potentially popular, there could be a C-Lightning plugin that just replicates whatever backup.
Oh yeah, I mean, that's how our development works as well, and I wanted to sort of point that out in the second to last slide, which is basically we do learn from what other teams do, and we do bring some of these innovations back to the specification to be discussed. And if there is a clear winner when it comes to usability and other trade-offs, then there is absolutely no hurdle from actually having that become part of the specification itself. At which point it sort of becomes available to all users, to all implementations.
Cool. And again, you alluded to this, but what exactly does need to be backed up? Chris Stewart did a very good presentation at Lightning Conference last year on the 6 different private keys that you need to think about with Lightning. Some need to be hot, some need to be cold. What exactly needs to be backed up in these different scenarios? The state and the keys.
So obviously the first one is basically the seed key that you use to generate all of your addresses. So that's pretty much identical to on-chain. It's what creates all of these addresses that are used throughout the lifetime of your funds. When they enter or leave a channel, they will end up on addresses that are generated from that. So that's the central piece of private information that you need to back up. And then we have a variety of parts where keys are used that are not directly derived from this seed key. Namely, whenever you and your peer with which you have a channel open need to generate a shared address, that will not be part of your derivation tree that is rooted in the seed key, and so those keys need to be backed up along the way. And this includes HTLC secrets. So whenever a payment goes through your channel, you better remember what the key was that this payment was contingent on. The address, the indices of the database of the channel in the database, because that's the index of the derivation path that is going to be used. And my favorite key in all of this, and revocation secrets. Those are important because that's basically the poison we use to keep each other honest. And of course, my absolute favorite is the per commitment points, which is an ECDSA point that is added to your direct output if I close the channel. And so without that point, you wouldn't even recognize that these funds are supposed to go to your node. And yeah, so that's a really weird use of these point tweaks because they are basically in there to make sure that each state commitment is unique. But it just makes it so hard to create an on-chain wallet for Lightning. Yeah, when I stumbled over those and had to implement the wallet, I just swore.
Yeah, it's challenging. What about Watchtowers? Is there a role for Watchtowers with backups? They're predominantly there so that you don't have to be online the whole time, and so they can stop someone from cheating you. But is there a role for them to store some state on your behalf? Like, do you see the role of a Watchtower expanding and different services being provided around a Watchtower?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the role of a Watchtower is definitely not clear-cut as such. I usually tend to think of a Watchtower as solely as a third party that I put in charge of reacting when something nefarious happens on chain. But of course, this definition can be expanded to also include arbitrary data storage on behalf of a node in exchange, maybe for a small fee. So I wouldn't say that there is a clear-cut boundary between a Watchtower and the backup service. Simply, I guess the name sort of implies which is the primary use. For Watchtowers, that's watching your channels in order to react if your counterparty dies or does something nefarious. Whereas backups are basically there to store your previous or your database changes, so that you can recover the state later on. So if we add a way for nodes to retrieve data from a Watchtower, it basically becomes a backup server as well. So little known secret is that the punishment transactions that we send over to a Watchtower are actually encrypted, and so the encrypted data could basically be anything. It could be your backup. So if you ever end up needing an arbitrary data storage, just pay a Watchtower to store it for you and hope they give it back to you if you need it.
Yeah.
There's actually a question regarding Watchtowers. I'm not quite sure if you just implicitly answered it, but are you planning on implementing Watchtowers in C-Lightning, or are there like any plans?
Absolutely. I mean, for a long time we've seen C-Lightning more of a hosted solution where you run your node at home, or you run it in some data center, and you then remotely connect to it. So our nodes would be online 24/7. But there has been quite a bit of demand for Watchtowers for functionality as well. So what I did in the last release, no, it's not yet released, but there is a hook for plugins that basically push the penalty transaction for each of the prior states to a plugin. And the hook basically is just a mechanism for us to tell the plugin some piece of information in a synchronous manner, so that the plugin can then take this information and move it off to somewhere else, your Watchtower backend, for example, before we continue with the process of the Lightning channel itself. And so that way we make sure, yes, the Watchtower has the information that needs to be stored before we can make progress on the channel itself. And so by pushing that into a plugin, we can enable our Watchtower producers to basically create their own connection or protocols to talk to our Watchtowers, and we don't have to sort of meld that into the Lightning node itself. So it's very much on our roadmap now, and I think I have 3 variants of the Watchtower hook, and it should hopefully be in there in the next release.
Great, thanks.
And then with end users or people with private channels on the edge of the network versus routing nodes in the middle, do you think the backup strategy or the backup setup will be different for those two participants on the network?
Yeah, so I do think that as the routing nodes inside of the network start to professionalize, they will probably start moving up their or professionalizing their data backend as well. And so I foresee mostly businesses and routing nodes starting to use more and more the replicated database backends. And for end users, I do think that the backup plugins provide a very nice trade-off between having the functionality of a backup, but not having to have the big setup or upfront cost of setting up a replicated database and automated failover and all of that stuff. And so that's basically the 2 rails that we've chosen, and that sort of cover these 2 use cases, right? Professional node operators and your geeky son that sets up a node for the rest of the family, basically.
Because yeah, if you are that end user on the edge of the network, you don't have to worry so much about going down at the time that you're routing a payment, because that's the big challenge here, isn't it?
Yeah.
You need to have that latest state, and so if there's some bizarre timing, that's when it becomes really technically difficult.
Yeah. So I've recently done a restore of one of my nodes that actually does quite a bit of probing in the network, and I think it had like a week's backlog of changes, and it recovered in 7 or 8 minutes. So that might be too much for a professional operator, but for me sitting at home, not doing my grocery shopping or not buying anything on Amazon, 7 minutes of downtime while I restore my node is perfectly fine. But even then, we do have trade-offs. I mean, we can have backup plugins that also replicate the database in the background, and then it takes just a couple of seconds to fail over.
Okay. Any more questions on backups, Jeff? Or should we go on to the many questions on all kinds of Lightning and C Lightning stuff?
Well, there seem to be a couple of database-specific questions, but I think that's something we can take like in the after chat.
Yeah, I'll definitely hang around as well and answer a couple of them.
Okay, so let's go to some of these Twitter questions. So you mentioned L2. One of the questions, I can't remember who sent it, was when Ccache no input. So obviously you don't know when, but is there any chance of getting it into the next soft fork with Taproot, or has that ship sailed? And if that ship has sailed, like what is viable for getting it into Bitcoin if we ever get it in?
I mean, it would be awesome if we could get Ccache no input or Ccache any prev out, which is AJ's proposal, into the soft fork that is rolling out Taproot and Schnorr. The problem being that all of the reviewers currently are focused mainly on Taproot, and it's really hard to grab people and sort of get them to discuss yet another proposal that we might want to have in the same soft fork. So while I think it is still possible, I'm pretty sure that it will be a secondary, maybe lighter soft fork at a later point, maybe bundled with some more lightweight proposals, which require less changes to the structure itself, and so it's easier to review as well and sort of see what kind of parts of the code base is being touched and what the side effects are. Because Taproot and Schnorr are kind of a big change all at once. That being said, AJ has taken Ccache no input, and with his any prev out, he's formulated out all of the details that need to change in Ccache no input for it to nicely mesh with Schnorr and Taproot. And so with his proposal, we could end up with a very nice bundle of changes that can be deployed at a later point in time, independently of Taproot and Ccache and Schnorr. So I remain optimistic that we can get it in, but I can't promise anything.
And then do you have any thoughts on whether planning for the next soft fork can really happen seriously until we have what is likely to be, no one knows, what is likely to be the Schnorr Taproot soft fork first? Can there be a parallel process happen, or do we really need to get all of those core reviewers and core brains on the one soft fork before we even get serious about any other soft fork?
I think it's probably best if we keep the distractions as low as possible while we do an important update like Taproot and Schnorr is. And so I personally also don't feel comfortable creating more noise by trying to push hard on Ccache no input. I think Schnorr and Taproot will get us many nice features, and I think that we shouldn't hold up the process by trying to push in more features while we're at it, because then it's sort of everybody wants their favorite feature in, and I don't see this particular feature being so life-changing that it should jump the queue, basically. I would like to have it in because I think L2 is a really nice proposal. Yeah, I'm self-congratulating again, but so hopefully we will get it at some point, but I don't think we need to stop the entire machinery just for this one proposal. And who knows, we might come up with better solutions. I'm under no impression that this proposal is perfect. So the more time we can spend on improving and analyzing, the better the outcome, I guess, in the end.
Yeah, cool. And then final one on Schnorr and Taproot. Have you been following the conversation on activation? Do you have any thoughts? How is there any way to speed up the process, or is this just going to be a long, drawn-out discussion?
Activation is a topic that many people like to talk about, and it's a very crowded space. And I have a tendency to stay out of these kinds of discussions where you already have too many cooks in the kitchen. I think whatever the activation mechanism is, it's going to be perfectly fine if it works. Yeah, don't really have a preference there, I would say.
Okay, very well maneuvered. Okay, let's go on to another question. So sorry, the Ccash no input question was from Froggle. I can't even say his Twitter. Frogolocopolis. That's the frog on Twitter, first class citizen. Okay, so another question from Sergey is, for the researchers and developers in the space, where should one put their efforts for the maximum positive impact on LN, Lightning Network? So obviously, you do a lot of stuff, like you're a researcher, you contribute to papers, you contribute to C Lightning, you do a lot of work on the protocol and the bulk specifications and this kind of stuff. How do you prioritize your time? Do you follow the Peter Wuller work on whatever's most fun, or do you try to prioritize the things that you think are most important?
Oh, definitely choose topics that interest you the most. I mean, I did my PhD on this, and it was amazing because you could actually jump around the whole space, and it was basically just a big green field where you could start building stuff, and it was all novel and new. And I get the feeling that Lightning is the same way. You all of a sudden you have this huge playground and which you can explore, and don't limit yourself to something that might be profitable or the cool thing. Do whatever interests you. And for me personally, I enjoy breaking stuff, and so I will always try to find out things that can be abused and sort of see if I can get away with it in sort of limits. But I mean, Lightning is cool to just explore and see what you can do. So if you want to increase security through Watchtowers, that's a good thing. If you want to increase privacy by sort of trying to figure out ways to break privacy, that's another good thing. And so whatever you like the most, I guess.
Cool, great advice. I'll continue with the Twitter questions, Jeff. You happy with that? Is there anything on the YouTube that you want to?
No, not so far. So if you have any questions, drop them now. It's a good time. I think the question you just posed.
Okay, I'll continue.
I was just curious. Like, I think it was about like efficiency, sort of like what point, like where's the best impact you can make. I think was the kind of intention of the question, and it's always something I think that's worth considering because we only have limited time and resources, right? So how can you, like, despite what interests you, like, how do you think one particular person can have the biggest impact? On a more general note, I guess.
Yeah, I do think that there are quite a few statements out there that need to be proven or disproven, and in particular, one thing that I like doing is attacking the privacy of the network. Of course, we now have completely different trade-offs when it comes to privacy from on-chain to off-chain. We don't leave eternal traces of our actions like we do on a blockchain. We don't leave those traces in Lightning, but we do talk to peers. What might these peers infer from our actions, and what information could they extract from that? So there's definitely the privacy aspect that is worth looking at. Then there is network formation games. If you've ever done game theory, finding a good way to create resilient networks but also networks that are efficient is a huge question. So how can we create a network where each node individually takes some decision, and we don't end up with one big node in the middle sort of becoming the linchpin, the single point of failure, that if that one goes down, everybody starts crying. So that's definitely an open research question. And also more fundamental stuff like how can we improve the protocol itself to be more efficient? How can we gossip better? How can we create an update mechanism that is more efficient, that is quicker, that needs less round trips? We do have one engineer, Rusty, who is in Australia, and he's always the guy who will try to get that half round trip shaved off of your protocol, and so that's his speciality, and so he has very much a focus on that. But I wouldn't say that there is an official list of priorities for the Lightning Network and associated research. It's basically you making your own priorities, though people tend to congregate on certain tracks, basically.
Right, thank you.
Cool. So another question from Pseudozak on Twitter. He'd like to ask your thoughts on the privacy papers. I believe you're an author of co-author of at least one.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe could you give a high-level summary and of those conclusions and thoughts?
So I basically started collecting data about the Lightning Network the moment we started, and so I do have a bit of backlog on the evolution of the Lightning Network. And so I've been approached by researchers over time who want to analyze this data. How did the network grow? What the structure is? What the success probabilities are? And so that's how I usually end up in these research papers. And so far, all of the analyses I think are very much on point. Purely the analysis of centrality in the network and the upsides and downsides, the efficiency that we get through more centralized networks, the resilience we get from distributing the network more. All of these are pretty nicely laid out in these papers. Now, in some papers, there is an attempt to extrapolate from that information, and that usually is not something that I encourage, because these extrapolations are based on on sort of the bootstrapping phase of the Lightning Network, and so it's not clear that these patterns and these behaviors will continue to exist when going forward. And it's mostly these extrapolations that people jump on when they say, "Oh, the Lightning Network is getting increasingly more centralized and will continue to become so." And so that's something that I don't like too much. The other one is that people usually fail to see that the decentralization in the Lightning Network is fundamentally different from the decentralization in the Bitcoin network. So in the Bitcoin network, we basically have a broadcast medium where everybody just exchanges transactions, and by glancing at when I learn information about which transaction, I can basically infer who the original sender is, and so on and so forth. In Lightning, the centralization of a network is not so, or the decentralization of the Lightning Network is not so important, because we do have quite robust mechanisms of preserving privacy, even though we are now involving others in our transactions. So we do have onion routing, we do have timing countermeasures, we do have mechanisms to add what's called shadow routes, which are basically just appendices to the actual route, pretending we send further than our actual destination. We fuzz the amounts so that the amounts are never round. There's never a $5 amount in in Bitcoin being transferred exactly over the Lightning Network. We've recently added multi-part payments, where payments of a certain size are split. And so unless you can correlate all of the parts, you will not even learn the exact amount being transferred. And all of these things are there to make the network more privacy preserving. Now, is it perfect? Of course not. But in order for us to improve the situation, we first have to learn about what's working and what's not working. And so that's my motivation behind all of these research papers, is basically to see, do our mitigations have an effect? If yes, how much more can we improve them? Or should we just drop our mitigation altogether because it might have a cost associated with it? And so while I think we are doing good, I think we could do better, and that's why we do these researches, and we do need to talk publicly about the trade-offs of these systems, because if we promise a perfect system to everybody, that's a promise that we've already broken, right? And so being upfront with the upsides, but also with the downsides of a system is important, I think.
And then kind of going back to the backup discussion where we were talking about hobbyists and enterprises, do you think it's important that there is a route for a hobbyist to set up a routing node, and that there are a lot of hobbyists running routing nodes, just so that people don't have to go through the enterprises? Or maybe we just need a lot more enterprises. I don't know, maybe both.
Does a hobbyist become an enterprise once he professionalizes enough?
Yeah.
I think so. There must always be the option for users to professionalize and become more proficient and more professional in their operations, and because that's something that we've gotten from Bitcoin. It's not that everybody must run a node. It's not that we suddenly have a new currency, but now suddenly everybody has the option of taking on their own responsibility and becoming their own custodian and not having to rely on other parties. We shouldn't shame people into doing that, but the option must be there for those interested. And I do think there is a wide spectrum of options that we can offer, from yes, I'll say it, custodial wallets, up to having fully self-sovereign nodes that run the full software stack at home, and you basically connect to your own realm in Bitcoin. And of course, there's a spectrum, and depending on your interest, you will land somewhere in there. We would like to have more people on the educated and the knowledgeable side of things, where they run as much as possible. But if you're somebody who just wants to accept the payment without having to read months and months into how Bitcoin works and how Lightning works and have to understand everything, I think there should be an option for that as well. But the important part is that it must be an option. We shouldn't be forcing people in one direction or another.
Makes sense. I'll continue with the Twitter questions. Jeff, please feel free to interrupt me at any stage if you have questions from the YouTube, but I'll continue with the Twitter ones otherwise.
I'll jump in. There's nothing so far. So if you have any questions, drop them in the YouTube comments, please.
Okay, so there are a couple of questions on real-time database replication. Antoine Ponsol said, is real-time database replication already in? He just merged his plugin some weeks ago, allowing backend customization. And Fiat Jaff also asks, can we get comments on real-time replicas made with Postgres?
Mm-hmm. So the replication of a Postgres database, or the setup of the Postgres database, is sort of something that we as C-Lightning do not include in our code, because it's basically just a backend that you write to. So it's basically up to the operator to set up a replicated set of Postgres servers, and then just pointing C-Lightning towards it. And that's definitely in there. I think it's been in there since 0.7.2. And so that's almost a year now. And so all you actually need to do is add --wallet equals Postgres, and then the username, password, and URL of where your database node lives, and it will basically then start talking to Postgres instead of a SQLite database on your local machine. And again, Gabriele Domenichini has an excellent tutorial on that, which I've linked in the presentation, which I'll link later on.
Very cool. Okay, another question from Fiat Jaff. This was an interesting one. This is on miniscript and custom HDLC types. So what should we think about custom?
Thinking that we arranged this ahead of time because Fiat Jaff is one of our best contributors.
Yeah, we've wrote a lot of plugins for Lightning plugins as well. So the second question was, what should we think about custom channels or custom HDLC types? Is that possible, feasible? Would integration of miniscript allow for such customization? Do you see miniscript playing a role?
I don't exactly see where miniscript comes in. It might be usable. It might be useful when it comes to actually having a fully flexible implementation where we can have external applications deciding on what kind of outputs we add. So one of the proposals, for example, is once we have L2, we can have multi-party channels where we can have any number of participants, basically, and the only thing that these multi-party channels decide is whether to add or remove or adjust the amounts on individual outputs. And the way we can describe those outputs could be in the form of miniscript. So that way, each participant in this ensemble of L2 participants is deciding on whether or not to add an output to the state of the channel, and they wouldn't actually need to know the exact application that is sitting behind it in order for them to decide on whether an output makes sense or not, because they would get a miniscript descriptor. But besides that, if we go back to the Lightning Network, it absolutely makes sense to have custom protocols between nodes. And these can include custom channels or custom assets being transferred on those channels, or even different constructions of HTLCs. The only thing that is important is that the two nodes that decide to use that certain custom protocol agree on what this custom protocol is and that they implement it correctly. And the second thing is that if we want to maintain the cohesion of the Lightning Network and the ability to transfer funds from point A to point B, we need to have an HTLC construction that is compatible with the pre-image trick that we're currently using, or the point contingency that PTLCs would bring. And so that means that if I receive an incoming HTLC from left, I can use whatever protocol I want to forward it to the right person if my right person knows that protocol. But we need to switch then back to normal HTLCs once we've left this channel. And so we can have mixes of different forwarding mechanisms and different update mechanisms and custom channel constructions, as long as from the outside it all looks compatible. And so that's also one thing that I pointed out in the L2 paper, is that L2 is basically a drop-in replacement for the update mechanism in Lightning. But since we don't change the HTLCs, I could receive an HTLC over Lightning penalty from Jeff, and I could forward it to you as an HTLC over L2 to you. And so we can exchange individual parts as long as on the multi-hop part, we do agree on certain standards that are interoperable.
because there is a line, right, between, I mean, you can't, between me and you, if we just have a payment channel open between me and you, we can do anything, right? Like, it's completely down to what us two want.
If
we're going to be
just pretending to transfer, I mean, I could, if we trust each other, and I'm sort of, we have the same operator, and we don't we can settle outside of the network. Jeff could send me an HLC. I could just tell you using an HTTP request and tell you, hey, it's okay. Just forward this payment to wherever it needs to go. We'll settle with a beer later. So even these constructions are possible where we don't even have to have a channel open between us to forward a payment if we trust each other. Or we could change the transport mechanism and transfer the Lightning packets over SMTP, or we could transfer them over ham radio, like some people have done. And so we can take parts of this stack of protocols and replace them with other parts that resemble or have the same functionality, but have different trade-offs.
But then if me and you have a channel that's one hop in the middle of a route from A to B, and we have a channel in the middle somewhere, there are some restrictions. We have to follow bolts, we have to be bolt compatible, etc., if we're going to be routing onion routed payments.
Yes. So there is one restriction, which is which basically is that we will only accept channel announcements if they correspond to an out point on the blockchain, and this is done as an anti-spam measure. So we would have to create something that looks like a Lightning channel if we were to pretend that there is a channel in the end. But other than that, you can basically do whatever.
And then just to wrap up this Fiat Jeff question, so that you don't think there's a role for mini scripts in terms of like custom scripts or making changes to those standardized Lightning scripts that most of us would be using?
Oh, there might absolutely be a point to it, but miniscript is sort of a mechanism where we can express something that some structure of or some output that we haven't agreed upon ahead of time, right? So I could tell you, hey, please add this output here, and I wouldn't have to tell you before we start the channel how this needs to look like. I can just send you a miniscript. So miniscript is a bit of a tool that allows us to talk about scripts. But currently in the Lightning protocol, all of the scripts are defined in the specification itself. So for us, there is currently no need to talk about potentially different structures of outputs. But there might be a use where we can add this flexibility and decide on the fly what a certain output should look like. Cool. There's just never been this need to meta talk about outputs because we already know what this looks like.
So I think that leads very nicely on to the next question from Nadav Cohen, who's been doing a lot of work on PTLCs. So instead of miniscript and scripts, perhaps we're using scriptless scripts and PTLCs. Nadav's question is, what are the biggest obstacles, pain points to implementing protocol changes in a Lightning node? E.g., if we wanted stuckless payments or PTLCs?
Yeah, it varies a lot. So depending on where this change is being made, it might require changes to just a single line of code, which is always a nice thing because you get a changelog entry for 10 seconds of work. And some others require really reworking the entire state machine of a Lightning channel, and those often require months of work, if not longer. Now for PTLCs, it would not be too hard. It basically just changes the way we grab the pre-image on the downstream HTLC and then hand it over to the upstream HTLC, it would basically just now be an additional computational step in there. Instead of taking a pre-image here and applying it here, it would basically take a pre-image here or a signature here, modify it slightly, and that gives you whatever is needed to be plugged in on the other side. When it comes to deeper changes to the state machine, we, for example, have the anchor outputs proposal currently, which would require us to rework quite a lot of our on-chain transaction handling, and so we try to be very slow and deliberate about which changes of this caliber we add to the specification, because they usually bring a lot of work with them. And of course, the extreme case of all of this is if we were to add L2, that would basically be reworking the entire state machine of the entire protocol, and that's a major work. So yes, L2 has its downsides too.
So Nadav has he's been working on PTLCs, and I think he implemented with Jonas Nick and a few others PTLCs with ECDSA. So do you think there should be a lot more work on things like channel factories before L2, because L2 is probably going to be a while?
I'm a bit hesitant when it comes to channel factories, because depending on what day it is, they're either brilliant or they're just stupid. And being one of the authors of that paper, I don't know. The main problem with channel factories is that we require multi-party channels first, because what channel factories do is basically they take some shared funds that are managed collaboratively between a number of participants, and they then take part of that and move it into a separate sub-channel in that construction. And that has the advantage that since we are no longer the entire group that needs to sign off on changes, but just the two of us that now need to basically agree on what happens to these funds in the sub-channel, it's way quicker to just collect 2 signatures rather than 15. That's basically the main upside. The downside, of course, is that first we need to have this group of 15. And the way we implement this group of 15, the multi-party channel, needs to either be a duplex micropayment channel, which is a very old paper of mine, which never really took off because its blockchain footprint is kind of large, or we use L2, which allows us to set up these very lightweight 15 of 15 or 60 of 60 channels. And then we can add channel factories on top for efficiency. The reason I'm saying that depending on the day, the channel factories sound kind of weird is that, well, we already have an off-chain construction where we can immediately sign off on changes without having to have yet another level of indirection. But then there's the efficiency gain. And so, yeah, still undecided. I don't know.
Okay, and let's just wrap up Nadav's question. What can we do to encourage better modularity? Is this important considering a approaching Taproot world?
I don't know exactly which kind of modularity he's referring to.
I guess modularity in the implementations, but maybe I'm misunderstanding it.
Yeah, I think the modularity of the protocol and the modularity of the implementations pretty much go hand in hand. Simply because if the specification has very nice modular boundaries where you can where you have separation of concerns. One thing is manages updates of states, and one thing manages basically how we communicate with the blockchain, and one thing manages how we do multi-hop security. Then that automatically leads to a structure which is very modular. The downside, the issue that we currently have is that the Lightning penalty mechanism, namely the fact that whatever output we create in our state must be penalizable, makes it so that basically this update mechanism leaks into the entire rest of the network of the protocol stack. So I showed before how basically we punish the commitment transaction if I were ever to publish an old commitment. But if we had an HTLC attached to that, this HTLC too would have to have the facility for me to punish you if you published this old state with this HTLC that had been resolved correctly or incorrectly or timed out. And so there's this. It's really hard in the penalty mechanism to have a clear-cut separation between the update mechanism and the multi-hop mechanism and whatever else we build on top of the update mechanism, because it just leaks into each other. And so that's something that I really like about L2 is that we have this clear separation of this is the update mechanism and this is the multi-hop mechanism, and there is no sort of interference between the two of them. And so I think by clearing up the protocol stack, we will end up also with cleaner separations, with more modular implementations. And of course, as C-Lightning, we also try to expose as much as possible from the internals to plugins, so that plugins are first-class citizens in the Lightning nodes themselves, and so they have the same power that most of our pre-shipped tools have. One little known fact, for example, is that the pay command, which is used to pay a Bolt 11 invoice, is also implemented as a plugin. And so the plugin takes care of decoding the invoice, of initiating a payment, of retrying if a payment has failed, of splitting a payment if it's too large, or adding a shadow route, or adding fuzzing, or all of this stuff is all implemented in a plugin. And the bare bones implementation of C-Lightning is very, very light and doesn't come with a lot of bells and whistles. But we make it so that you have the power of customizing it and so on and so forth. And there we do try to keep a modular aspect to C-Lightning, despite the protocol not being a perfectly modular system itself.
Cool, thank you. And then a second question from Fiat Jaff. There was a mailing list post from Joost, proposal for upfront payments. Did you see this?
Yep.
If you did, Fiat Jaff has some questions.
We might have
about it, but then it seemed to have stopped. Why haven't we seen more development on that direction? In that direction?
You dropped out there temporarily. Could you repeat the question?
Oh, sure. Sorry. So Fiat Jaff had a question on upfront payments, and it was, what are the issues with upfront payments? There was discussion about it, but then it seems to have stopped. Why haven't we seen more development in that direction yet?
Yes. So upfront payments was or is a proposal that came up when we first started probing the network, because probing basically involves sending a payment that can never ever terminate correctly, but by looking at the error code that we receive back, we learn a bit about the network, and it's for free because those payments never actually terminate. That brought up the question of, hey, aren't we using somebody else's resources by creating HTLCs with their funds as well, but not paying them for this service? And so the idea came up of having upfront payments, which basically means that if I try to route a payment, I will definitely leave a fee even if that payment fails. And so that's kind of neat. But the balance between working and non-working is kind of hard to get right. The main issue is that if we pay upfront for them just receiving a payment, and not forwarding a payment, then they might be happy to just take the upfront fee and just fail without having any stake in the system. Because if I were to receive an incoming HTLC from Jeff and I need to forward it to you, Michael, and Jeff is paying me 10 millisatoshis for the privilege of talking to me, I might not actually take my half a Bitcoin and sort of lock it up in an HTLC to you, but I might just be happy taking those 10 millisatoshis and say, yeah, I'm okay with this. You try another route. So it's more it's an issue of incentivizing good behavior versus incentivizing basically just abusing the system to maximize your outcome. And so a mix of upfront payments and payment and fees contingent on the success of the actual payment is probably the right way, but we need to discuss a bit more, and people's time is sort of tight when it comes to these proposals. There's just been too much movement, I guess.
Okay, I think that's all my Twitter questions. I'm going to ask one of my own questions, if that's okay, Jeff. Or do we need to wrap? I have time for one?
Yeah, let's just do another one and then go move it into the private Jitsi room.
Okay, very good. So I've been reading a bit about simplicity, which your colleagues Adam Back and Russell O'Connor have been working on at Blockstream. So they talk about being able to do new SIGHASH flags, SIGHASH no input, any prev out, without a soft fork. So in a world where we had simplicity, perhaps the arguments against no input or any prev out, namely them being dangerous for users, no longer apply if simplicity was in Bitcoin and people could just use it anyway. Any thoughts on that?
That's an interesting question. How could I not get fired for for discussing this in public? No, I do think simplicity is an awesome proposal. It's something that that I would love to have, because so far during my PhD and during my work at Blockstream, the number one issue that we had was basically that stuff that we want to do was blocked by them not being available in Bitcoin itself. And so it can be frustrating at times to come up with a really neat solution and not being able to actually enact them. As far as the criticism to SIGHASH no input goes and SIGHASH any prev out, we shouldn't take them lightly, and I do see points where people bring up good points about there being some uncertainty and there being certain insecurities when it comes to double spending, when it comes to securing funds, and how do we clamp down this proposal as much as possible so that people can't inadvertently abuse it. But I do think that that with all of the existing systems that we already have in Bitcoin, we're currently trying to save a sandcastle while the dike is breaking behind us, right? So it sort of doesn't. It's a disproportionate amount of caution when we already have some really dangerous tools in the Bitcoin protocol itself. First and foremost, who invented SIGHASH? None. I mean, you can have a signature that does not cover anything, but you can still spend funds with it. So while I do take criticism seriously, I don't think that we need to spend too much time on that. And indeed, if we get simplicity, a lot more flexibility could be added. But of course, with great power comes great responsibility, and so we need to make sure that that people that want to use those features do know the trade-offs really well, and don't put user funds at risk. And that's always been something that we've pointed towards, and yeah, we need to have tech-savvy people doing these custom protocols. Otherwise, you should stick with what's tested and proven.
And obviously, simplicity is still far off and won't be in Bitcoin anytime soon. So,
I
just a
think
theoretical question.
recently had a simplicity-based transaction on Elements. So we do have. We do have a network that where we test these experimental features, sort of to just showcase that these are possible and what possible implementations could look like. And so that's our testing ground basically. And Russell has used his simplicity implementation on some of these transactions.
Very cool. Okay.
Quite some cool stuff in there, like quines and stuff.
Very nice. Okay, so do we need to wrap up now, Jeff?
Yeah, I think we can come to an end. It's been a lot of questions, and there's like a couple more, but I think we can take it to Jitsi.
I have one last one lighter one. Christian, can you ask Lisa to change her Twitter avatar? Because it's so confusing. I keep thinking Jack Dorsey is tweeting about Sea Lightning.
Do I look like Jack Dorsey?
No. Lisa,
Lisa,
colleague,
okay.
has Jack Dorsey as a Twitter avatar.
Yeah, Lisa is her.
Maybe you can ask her to change it.
She needs to change. She changes quite often her avatar. So
I just need to be patient.
All right.
Okay,
so
that's it from me. Thank you, Christian, for answering.
If you couldn't get your question in, there's one great opportunity upcoming. We're going to have another Lightning Hack Sprint next weekend, and Christian already said he's going to be there, and all of Blockstream is coming. I think. No, I'm just kidding.
I think our marketing people won't be there.
No. But you said you wanted to bring us some more people, which is cool. But you're definitely going to be there. I'm posting the link right now, and so we're not going to have a Potzblitz episode next week, but we're going to have a Lightning roundtable, wrapping up all the results of the Lightning Hack Sprint. And now I'm just going to post the Jitsi room to YouTube so you can join and ask Christian some more questions. Thank you, Christian, for coming, and thank you, Michael, for coming. Thank you both for the work you're doing and propelling Bitcoin further to the moon and Mars and beyond.
It's a lot of fun.
Yeah. All right. Here's the link, and this was episode number 4 of Potzblitz. See you in 2 weeks. Lightning Hack Sprint next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Christian.